Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
A warm welcome to all. Today we will discuss natural and unnatural disaster and the city, and in this lecture we will be covering what is natural and what is unnatural disaster. Then we will be focusing on natural and unnatural disaster and the city, the different components of hazards including the risk, exposure, vulnerability and the response. Then we will also discuss few cases where we will examine the natural and the unnatural disaster and their interaction with the society. The natural disasters like the Katrina in the US and its effects on the ex-prisoners will be discussed. Then we will discuss on the unnatural disaster like the devastating fire which swept through one of the many shack settlements in the South Africa will again be discussed under this context. According to Peter Alagona, a natural disaster is a destructive event caused by the forces of nature. According to him, the natural disaster can also be defined as natural events that are uncommon enough to be considered outside the range of normal human experience and therefore present extreme challenges when they eventually do occur. Examples of natural disasters could be hurricane, cyclone, tsunami, earthquake, wildfire and others. I am sure some of us must have witnessed some or the other form of natural disaster in our life, and our experiences of the disaster will be more or less similar in their nature, where the feeling of losing control over the situation might persist for a longer time. When we talk about the unnatural disaster, then as the word suggests, they arise from the unnatural causes. For example, just imagine the 9/11 attack that happened on the World Trade Center. That could be termed as an unnatural disaster. This also caused the loss of life as the natural disaster would, however, had different geopolitical consequences than any other natural disaster if we consider. When we analyze both the natural and the unnatural disaster, then both of them have the power to uproot the normal life of people residing at a certain place, and they also have the power to disturb their socio-economic conditions. When we consider the cities, then scholars found that even the most developed cities in the world are not immune to both of the disasters, be it natural or the unnatural disaster. If we consider the largest urban areas in the world, then we can find that both natural and unnatural disasters have struck them at some point of time. For example, the natural disasters like Florida and US faced 3 hurricanes like Elsa, Fred and Mindy in 2021. The Dixie fire, which burned close to 1 million acres in California in 2021, became the first fire to cross over the Sierra Nevada range. Swarms of locusts that attacked Asia, East Africa, India and Middle East in the 2020, where you must have remembered like states like Gujarat, Haryana, Madhya Pradesh, Punjab, Rajasthan and UP, they saw effect of these pest attacks at a larger scale. Cyclone Amphan, which affected Bangladesh and India in 2020, is classified as one of the most powerful deadly tropical cyclone that had ever happened. In case of the unnatural disaster, we find that the most striking at the world level are the 9/11 attack, the explosion at the Chernobyl, and we all know about the Bhopal gas tragedy that happened in the 1984, where there was a gas leakage at the pesticide plant in Bhopal affecting people on a larger scale. When we compare the natural and the unnatural disaster, then their geopolitical consequences can be different, as it was emphasized by Peter Alangona, where he gives an example of the Hurricane Katrina, which brought relief for the US from different countries. But if we consider the 9/11 attack, then after that the US launched 2 wars in foreign countries, which was again a geopolitical consequence of the unnatural disaster. If we consider the consequences of disasters on city, then we find that disaster in each city has brought in different components of hazards, including the risk, exposure, vulnerability, and response. It was during the United Nations sponsored International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction in 1990 to 2000 that a high priority was accorded to addressing megacity disaster problems. As part of this effort, the International Geographical Union established a study group on the disaster vulnerability. James Michael in 1999 examined the study group major project and introduced research on the urban disaster vulnerability. We will focus on some of them during this lecture. According to him, throughout history, urban hazards and disasters have included a mix of natural, technological, and social events. According to him, in every instance, they pose a threat to the human life. For example, since 1945, earthquakes have been a major natural hazard in Tokyo, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Mexico City, and Lima, while floods have posed the most serious natural risk in London, Dhaka, and Seoul. Infectious diseases like epidemics such as cholera, which happens for example in Lima, and AIDS in San Francisco, have affected most of the cities, especially covering the Asia and the Latin America. Similarly, he finds that the technological hazards like the residential and the commercial fires in Tokyo, Seoul, Lima, and Dhaka, and the industrial fires and explosion, which are more significant in London, Mexico City, Mumbai, and US cities, they have posed serious hazards to the people residing in these cities. According to him, the components of hazards like risk, exposure, and vulnerability has changed. According to him, risk is simply a measure of the spatial and the temporal probability of an extreme natural event. Exposure in that case is a measure of the degree to which people and property are likely to be affected by such an event. Vulnerability is a measure of the degree to which those who are exposed are likely to suffer a loss. Response in that case is a measure of action taken by a group of people to offset the undesired risk, exposure, and vulnerability, including previous flawed responses. For him, risks are most stable component of hazard. According to him, there is very little chance that risk will change over time due to the natural conditions. For example, when we face the earthquake, the risks are stable, but if we face the flood, due to human interventions, then the risks are not stable in this case. A study in the UK, Sheffield University, was published in the European Geosciences journal named The Natural Hazards Earth System Sciences, where the study claimed that considering the global fatal landslide database, at least 700 out of 4,800 the fatal landslides that occurred from 2004 to 2016 in India, they were caused by the construction work, illegal mining, and unregulated hill cutting. The Kedarnath landslide in Uttarakhand, which happened in June 2013, caused by the flash flood that resulted over 5,000 deaths, was identified as the most tragic of such disaster. According to Michael, when humans intervene in the natural processes, then it is an important source of increased risk. He gives the example of land conversion and the creation of engineered drainage networks which have the potential to greatly alter the urban hydrological cycle. Similarly, the disappearance of open spaces to construct building, market, etc., according to him, is directly connected with increased runoff and flood losses in Sheol. Then he talks about how exposure is the degree to which human population are at risk. Here he states that in case of megacities where the cities expand, with them the exposure to risk expands to the peripheral areas. For example, now there is a shift of risk exposure from San Francisco Bay metropolis to the east side of the San Francisco Bay, such as the Oakland and the Hayward. Then he talks about the vulnerability as the potential for loss. According to him, polarization and spatial segregation with respect to income and risk are increasingly visible in North American and European countries. For example, Los Angeles rich suburbanites are more exposed to the wildfire risk and subsequent slow failures, whereas the inhabitants of less affluent neighborhoods are more likely to be affected by the earthquakes. When it comes to responding to these disasters, he also finds that some megacities are preparing themselves and others do not have such mechanisms in place. He finds while disaster recovery and improved preparedness can stand alone as public issue during this period because they command the support of many victims or other affected group, it is often difficult to sustain the public interest and involvement in the disaster policy making for very long time at other times. United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction in 2019 reported that climate related disasters accounted for about 90% of the 7,255 major disasters that occurred between 1999 and 2017, most of which were flood and storms. United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction in 2012 and 13 proposed that rapid urbanization and population growth as the main factors for natural disasters. United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction in 2010 also suggested that city planners and local governments are the key actors in effort to reduce the risk posed by the natural hazards by build resilience urban society. Let us now discuss the case of a natural disaster and its interaction with the society to understand these dynamics further. David S. Crick in his study analyzed how natural disasters like the hurricanes induced migration had any negative or even beneficial effects on the likelihood of the recidivism among the ex-prisoners. According to Langan and Levin, 2/3 of the former prisoners in the United States are rearrested within 3 years of prison release, and a half repeat the same undesirable behavior. According to David Crick, geographical context plays an important role in such incidences. He finds that ex-prisoners are generally geographically concentrated within the most resource-deprived sections of the metropolitan area and return to the same neighborhood upon their release. Thus, he tries to find if there is any connection between certain places in the urban areas and crime, and especially what happens when natural disaster foster migration in these scenarios. In US, the repeated offenders who keep on repeating offenses throughout their life are more. However, such behavior has been accorded to the absence of social controls like the stable unemployment and healthy marriage, These were done by Samson and Lobb. However, Lobb and Samson find that change in the residential area can act as a turning point in the life of the offenders. Similarly, using the Cambridge study of delinquent development, Osborne established that delinquents who subsequently moved away from London were significantly less likely to be reconvicted of a crime than the delinquents who stayed in London itself. Thus, some scholars, as we discussed earlier, show how cities and place of residence is connected with the persistence of a criminal behavior. According to David Creek, change in association with criminal peers and a change in one's routine activities can bring in a great amount of change within the individual's life. As Ward convincingly demonstrates, criminal conduct is predominantly social behavior. Most offenders are imbibed in a network of friends who also break the law, and the single strongest predator of the criminal behavior known to the criminologist is the number of delinquent friends an individual has. He also suggests that marriages reduce the likelihood that an individual will associate with the delinquent peer and affect the amount of time individual spends with the delinquent peers. David Creek in his study only considered the ex-prisoners who were committed to prison from Orleans Parish and the 4 parishes adjacent to the Orleans, like the Jefferson, the Paliquins, the St. Bernard and the St. Tammany. These areas sustained substantial housing damage after the Hurricane Katrina. Considering the prisoners' residential options released post-Katrina, resulting in some measures of geographic displacement, Creek only considered these as their respondent. He found that individuals who migrated to different parishes were significantly and substantially less likely to be reincarcerated with 1 year of release from the prison. He also finds that all paroles, whether it was their first release or those with multiple prior incarcerations, are significantly less likely to be reincarcerated if they migrate to a different parish. Thus, his findings suggest that moving away from a former place of residence serves some benefit for the parolees. And in this case, a natural disaster then served as a factor for such benefit. Now, let us discuss a second case of South Africa where we will examine how unnatural disaster affect the residents. Martin J. Murray examines Alexandra Township of Johannesburg, where in 2003 a devastating fire swept one of the many shack settlements. The fire was caused when one early morning an apparently distracted woman living in a dilapidated shack at the corner of the 5th Avenue and London Road accidentally overturned a cooking stove upon which she had been frying eggs for the breakfast. The small blaze quickly turned into a ferocious firestorm that burned out of control for 3 hours and spread across tightly packed warren of the makeshift dwellings. According to Murray, the efforts of the firefighter were severely affected by the spatial agglomeration of the squatter, the tiny shack arranged kick by jawl, sometimes built precariously one on the top of other, laid out along narrow, meandering footpaths. It burned down 300 makeshift living, more than 600 people homeless and virtually destitute. Since their homes were regarded as illegal squatters, the homeless victims of the fire were not given any assistance by the Municipal Social Service Agency and in obtaining funds for rebuilding their modest homes. The residents of Johannesburg City, according to Murray, revealed the ironies and contradictions of a post-apartheid revitalization strategy, which weighed in favor of the established Johannesburg as a world-class city, while at the same time largely overlooked the immediate needs of the jobless urban poor who lack the adequate housing, basic infrastructure and the requisite social services. According to Murer, these urban catastrophes cannot be separated from the material geographies of the vulnerability unevenly spread across the metropolitan landscape. For him, the social nature of such artificial hazards, that is, the underlying structural condition that makes such social catastrophes inevitable in the first place, must be emphasized, and these hazards should not be considered to have happened by chance. Eric Klinenberg, in his study of the 1995 Chicago heat wave, suggests that scholars commit two errors when they just look at the death, human suffering and destruction that these incidences bring in. First, by stressing on the uncovering the immediate or the proximate causes for outbreak of devastating fires like the human error, negligence or the carelessness of the squatters, they ignored the connection between the spatial geography of the vulnerability and the everyday ecology of the inequality. Second, by considering them as the human tragedy, scholars ignored the structural patterns of determinants of the unequal vulnerability to disaster by certain sections of people. According to Murer, these events should not be considered as natural, rather as preventable social catastrophes. He states that in order to grasp the social nature of this unnatural disaster, it is necessary to jump scales. That is, to move from accounting for why individuals fire starts to explanations of the overall pattern, trends and frequencies of fire events taken in the aggregate. For him, the extraordinary events like the devastating fire, flooding and freezing cold can reveal not only the precarious balance between the land use pattern and the natural environment, but also the stark inequalities in the spatial distribution of risk. Brown and McCarthy suggest that the sack fire revealed the disaffiliation of the urban poor from the world of work, from decent housing and from basic social services that is a part of the normal functioning of urban governance under the hegemony of neoliberal ideologies and practices. According to Murer, the spatial layout of informal settlement, the choice of highly combustible building materials, inadequate strategies for fire prevention and suppression and exposure to risk come together to produce the objective condition for the social disaster. According to Murer, various scholars have distinguished between a materially produced first nature and socially constructed second nature, thereby drawing attention to the lived reality of the hazardous place. Hewitt, Croron, Demety have stressed on the production of hybridized metropolis or the second nature, where the social production of the urban space is highlighted, which unevenly distributes the vulnerability to hazards, exposure to risk and ecological breakdown. Here, the politics of scarcity influences how cities are built in their concrete form, where the underprivileged are the ones who, due to unbalanced spatial distribution, face the human tragedy. According to Murer, the city building in Johannesburg has always been an uneven process, where class hierarchy and racial structure are inscribed in the morphological form of the urban landscape. According to him, the fire has exposed how the city builders like the real estate moguls, architects and corporate builders, engineers or the high-rank municipal officers, urban planners and the housing authorities have focused on the urban glamorous zone, neglecting the jobless and the homeless residents of the city. According to him, the haphazard growth of the urban landscape has produced what can be called the galactic metropolis, which has fragmented the city into extreme. one of the residents with luxurious wealth and the other with abject poverty. According to Murrah, this has created a new kind of exclusionary urbanism where the economically secure are able to disentangle themselves from a shared civic life with the urban poor. He finds that virtually all the firestorms that have gutted informal settlements in Johannesburg include the inadequate fire prevention measures, particularly the inefficient firefighting procedures and the lack of proper equipment. According to Weissner, in order to truly comprehend the connection between the hazards and the risk prone environment, it is necessary to distinguish between the proximate causes for particular fire events, like the faulty wiring, overturned stoves, dangerous coal burning, and the systemic root causes of disaster vulnerability, namely the socio-economic marginality of the residents of the informal squatters settlement and the environmental degradation. Weissner suggests that social catastrophes like the periodic firestorm cannot be solved through the technical solution. Rather, in this case, we need to look into the disparate patterns of urban living that stem from the gross inequalities of wealth and power. According to Murrah, the main ingredients of a perfect firestorm in the makeshift shacks are: first, the material with which the makeshift shacks are made, like the wood, cardboard, zinc plating, and the plastics, which are highly combustible. Second, the widespread use of coal burning stove for cooking, faulty electrical connection, the gas cylinders, and the unprotected candles. They provide ripe conditions for the easy ignition. Finally, the fire suppression is made even more difficult by the combination of the spatial layout of informal squatter settlements, slow response time of the firefighting teams, lack of proper equipment, and inadequate water resources serve the purpose. According to Brown and McCarthy, informal squatter settlements effectively expose the shelterless poor, stripping them of the rights to unimpeded movement, the right to protection, and even the right to claim rights. According to Murrah, the structural underpinnings of the susceptibility to unnatural disaster are linked to uneven patterns of the social inclusion into the mainstream of the urban life. Thus, we find that both natural and unnatural disaster in this case affect the city and its residents and their interaction with the society. So, thank you for listening and have a great day ahead.